Welcome everyone to Admin 2406 Social and Ethical Issues in Business. My name is Tony Fabiano and I'm your instructor for the course. On this very first slide you see an image with the words "Got Ethics" and a question mark. And the image is meant to inspire us to think about who we are as individuals and how we make ethical choices that affect others. It's also meant to remind us or inspire us to think about our character, think about our moral compass, the ethical conscience that each of us have, and how we're going to use our ethical conscience when we get into the workplace, if we're not already in the workplace. So what are we doing in this course? In this course, we examine ways to look at moral reason as a guide to our actions or our choices, our decisions. And in order to be able to do this, we have to have a starting point. The starting point is usually the acknowledgement of our ability to self-reflect. Self-reflection is going to be a key marker for the growth that we have in developing as ethical practitioners. You will hear me say often during the course that our aim is to become ethical practitioners, to use the ideas that we learn about to better understand the different ways of thinking so that when it comes time to making a choice, we have more to call upon. So in other words, we have a broadened landscape of sources from which to make good choices. And ultimately, we are aimed squarely at that. The study of ethics is also the study of becoming a better person. And it requires of us a sacrifice and a challenge in a variety of ways. It starts with examining our own intellect and the way that we think about the problems that we face, including those ones that we face in the workplace. It also starts, that is, the study of ethics, starts by looking at ourselves and who we are as people. In order to be able to make better choices, we have to get accustomed to analyzing situations, to reflecting upon the decisions that we've already made in our lives, the decisions that we learn from, whether they're good or whether they're bad. A lot of times the decisions we make in the workplace require us to examine a variety of options. So there may be more than one right choice to make. And if we have ethics and we have a moral compass or an ethical conscience, we're going to have more to call upon and we will be more successful and effective as global citizens in our aim to become ethical practitioners. In addition to thinking about our own moral compass and the fact that we will have to practice good decision making within the workplace, it makes sense to start out with a definition for business ethics. We define business ethics as the study of our moral values as they may be applicable to business. It deals more specifically with the reasoning of moral standards that originate from self, society, and corporate culture, as well as other domains such as religion and family. And to break that apart, what is meant by this definition is that we understand the study of ethics as originating from ourselves, i.e. our moral compass, as originating from our society, as in the rules that we're expected to follow and the laws that we follow within society, and the norms that are prevalent in any given society as well. In addition, we're looking at corporate culture and the expectations that we have within an organization. And collectively, all of these are sources for the standards that we need to follow from a moral perspective. So the moral standards, as an example, that we develop from ourselves might not be the same ones that we're expected to follow within the workplace. And we have to realize that ethics comes from a variety of different sources. So this is telling us about what those sources are. We can say self, society, the organization, religion, family, and a host of other sources provide the framework for who we are as ethical agents, where I'm trying to improve on each one of these areas and better understand how they lead us to the decisions that we make in our everyday lives and within business. Business ethics is also about questioning the everyday decisions that are made in a business environment. And when we question our decisions, and when we self-reflect, we are better able to think consciously about the avenues in the choices that we make and the different alternatives that we might have for solving a problem. So if we develop our capacity to be inquisitive and to ask questions, we can deeper analyze those decisions that we make. And of course, we can also analyze the decisions that others make. When we examine the decisions that we make, we're also able to carefully discern what should govern or guide our behavior in the business environment. As we said, some organizations may require that we follow a particular standard that we might not agree with. And in order to be able to question those standards, we need to be able to understand that they're based on ideas and they're based on values, and that a clearer understanding of those values or the unpacking of the decisions that we make is going to take us to a better place and allow for us to be ethical practitioners. So in addition to what we've talked about so far, to look at ethics from another angle, I'm providing a quote, very famous quote by an Irish poet named Oscar Wilde. And what Oscar Wilde said was that morality, like art, means drawing a line someplace. And by that, I think it's safe to assume that, at least in part, what he was really talking about is that when we become ethical practitioners, that we need to start thinking about the lines that we draw or the moral compass that we have for everyday values like honesty. And we appreciate when we think about our own understanding of honesty and how it might apply to an ethical situation. Or to think of it in another way and say that perhaps it is the case that I need to think more about how I feel when people lie to me. And so if we're drawing out, okay, I need to set a line for myself, then setting a line might sound something like, well, I've decided in my personal life that I am not going to accept people that lie to me. And most of us would agree to that particular value. We don't appreciate, we don't like when another person lies. But we have to understand that in all reality, people will lie. And when they do lie, what is going to be our tolerance for that? How many lies do we say is our limit? And if I'm talking about a personal friend as an example, if my personal friend lies to me more than once, do I need to keep them as a friend? And so when I'm thinking about my own moral character, I'm thinking, well, I need to be patient if my friend lies to me once, maybe twice. But at a certain point, I have to say also that if that individual consistently lies to me, that I'm probably not going to want to call him my friend. And so in the way of honesty, in talking about a value, this might be something for us to think about, that we need to establish a boundary or a line like Oscar Wilde is referring to. That's how our own understanding of morality begins, by drawing that line, by thinking about our own values, how patient, how honest, How tolerant am I when I make the decisions that I make? So our discussion today, if we have to give it a title, is Common Sense, Honesty, and Moral Virtue, the ethicist in the workplace. It is necessary for us to think about at the beginning of this course what kinds of things we're going to need to do, what changes we're going to be making to ourselves to allow us to be true ethicists in the workplace. And I think at the beginning, we need to dispel the myth of common sense. We need to talk a little bit about what that is in application or in connection with business ethics. We need to talk about honesty and drawing that concept out, as we've already done. And we need to talk about the cultivation of moral virtue before we enter into content that comes from the chapter textbook that we're looking at in this course. So before we look at chapter 1, we're looking at some of the necessary foundations for the study of ethics and introducing ourselves to that study. The common sense fiction in business ethics. A lot of the times we hear that people make decisions based on common sense. When we think about what common sense actually is, and we do that in a philosophical way, we can agree that there's really no universal system of rationality that all of us hold in common with each other. We might hold in common with each other instinctual decision-making skills, where if we're hungry, we need to eat. And so we pursue food because we're hungry. That's a decision that could be made using the source of common sense. But when we make ethical decisions, it goes beyond what is common and what is common sense or sensation to all of us. And it moves into also what is reasoned sense or what is good sense. And there's a difference between a decision that is made on common sense, one that is made on good sense, one that is made on articulated sense, or beyond sensation, or to couple with sensation. I make my decisions on sensation, and I make my decisions on reflection. So both my senses and my intellect are my guide. So when we think about common sense, we have to remind ourselves that it's not so common. We don't all think the same. We disagree. We should be able to share our disagreements with each other and work together towards a common goal. So we can't exclusively rely on common sense then. What reasons would someone have for believing that there is such a thing as common sense? I think a lot of the reason is because all of us are able to look around and agree that we make decisions based on common sense, choices, everyday choices, simple choices. But when we talk about ethical decisions, the choices are much more varied and much more challenging. So we don't want to say that it's a good idea to rely exclusively on common sense when we make ethical choices. We want to say it needs to move beyond common sense to reasoned sense or reasoned reflection, like we've said. All right, so in the study of business ethics and sort of introducing ourselves to the study of business ethics, it's important to also start with an example. And this is why we're talking about honesty at an early point in the course, before we really get started with examining different ethical ways of thinking. But honesty is generally what we call a character trait that people develop as ethical practitioners. It's a virtue that most people agree is praiseworthy. And that is to say, we appreciate people when they are honest towards us. We can also say, to some degree, we all have a moral duty to be honest to each other. And we learn this in a variety of different places, or it comes from a lot of different places. In addition to, let's say, our upbringing and our religious backgrounds and the way we were taught as children, and what we've been able to form as, our character thus far, has a lot to do with how we understand honesty. But we do say it's a character trait worth developing, at least in the study of business ethics. We need to be honest in our daily work. We need to be honest in our transactions. Where does honesty come from? And when I think about it, the origin point, we say ultimately comes out of theology and religious works, but it also comes from family, and of course it comes from traditional ethics, as I indicate on the slide. Traditional ethics meaning the very first philosophers, such as Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, who have all put tremendous effort into thinking about virtues like honesty and what we expect of others. We have a duty to be honest towards others in everyday life. This is true. We have a duty towards others in our everyday life, but when we think about how honest we are, and until we think about how honest we are, we're not able to gauge what kind of character we possess. So we do have to call upon ourselves, or as I said before, look inward to think about this. It begins with that sort of self-reflective, beginning, or self-reflective starting point. So we have a duty to be honest. Well, how honest am I? Would be what kind of question we would want to ask ourselves. How honest am I in my relationships with my friends and my family and the people that I work with every day eventually? The duty to be honest to others is then passed through the different types of interactions we have with others, including those ones we're going to have with people in our professional careers and in the business environments we're going to find ourselves in. So thinking about honesty is important for us. It's a good starting point in the way of trying to understand where we're headed with the content in the upcoming chapters of your textbook and in the course. So how does the virtue of honesty connect with other types of interactions? Well, think about the other types of interactions that we have with others. And when I do, I think about teachers and lawyers and healthcare providers and so forth. I also think about business professionals and the types of interactions I've had with different businesses and organizations, in my own life experience, as you would as well. What kind of experience I have, and the last time I visited my doctor or my nurse or a lawyer or a teacher. And we can think about honesty from a variety of different perspectives. And what we're doing here is drawing our personal attention to the fact that honesty as a character trait is something we need to work on or develop. And a course on business ethics is meant to sort of pass this information on, but also to get you to understand that we can practice honesty and we can have good relations with others. It's going to take some work, but that's the aim that we're putting ourselves towards. On this slide, we look at the ways that honesty can transform through what we might call a step process, from beginning to think about it to ideally practicing it. So we begin with honesty, and of course I'll talk about later how we can substitute honesty for another virtue or another sort of value that we can put in there. But it begins with self-reflection. After self-reflection begins, or through self-reflection, as I say, the individual recognizes the necessity of honesty in everyday interactions, or does not recognize the necessity. So the sooner we come to recognize that necessity, the sooner we can start to develop the underpinnings for what is going to become a practice of becoming more honest as an ethical practitioner. The next step would be those who recognize the necessity of honesty in everyday interactions may then realize that it is a duty, what we would call a moral duty that we expect from others, which necessitates that we ourselves practice it responsibly. In other words, we cannot hold another person to a duty without executing that duty for ourselves in their favor. So it's that exchange and being honest. And if we think about the example I started with before about the fact that we don't appreciate being lied to, how can we develop a standard for that in our personal lives? Later on, when we talk about the workplace, we might talk about how we can develop policies in our workplace where we necessitate the practice of honesty in our everyday relationships with each other within an organization. Then the duty of honesty makes its way into the professional interactions, as we've said, that we have with others in the business sort of environment. We look at codes of ethics later on in the course. We look at different policies that organizations hold or have put together, have developed. And we can talk about how that transfer, again, something that starts with me thinking about it, moves all the way through these steps and into the workplace. Lastly, the duty of honesty becomes codified in professional interactions. So we make it a necessity on the job in terms of codes of ethics and standards of practice that we would have within an organization. On this slide, we look at the question of, what other virtues or types of virtues add to our particular moral character. What traits can we develop that are transferred into the workplace in addition to honesty? As I said, we can substitute that on the last slide for any other virtues that we can think that would be applicable to both our personal lives as well as our professional lives in the workplace. So I'm putting a few of them on here for us to think about. Virtues such as loyalty, perseverance, courage, integrity, wisdom, justice, fairness, discretion, cooperation, compassion, tolerance, and punctuality. One of the most simple virtues that we try to develop in our professional careers, being on time, basically. When we think about something like compassion, we might ask, well, how do we make official the way we would like people, how compassionate we would expect them to be on the job? And a lot of that comes out of, as we've said, the self-reflection that we have on a personal level about what it means to be a compassionate person and what it means to exercise compassion as a virtue. One of the virtues that I haven't put on here that we can sort of think about as well is patience. And we've probably heard that expression before, that patience is a virtue. And the reason it is a virtue is because there is some sort of process, or that there is a process attached to understanding what the virtue of patience really means in our everyday lives. How patient do I need to be when I am communicating with others? How patient am I on a general sort of in a general way? And how does that meet up with tolerance, right? And you'll see there's some overlap between the virtues that we try to develop. But ultimately, all of them are fits for good moral character. And they allow us to make better judgments if we've, of course, spent the time to develop and cultivate those virtues prior to moving into or starting our professional careers in the workplace. So the images on this slide remind us of some examples of what happens when there is a lack of honesty in the workplace. One of the more recent and sort of current moral issues that we have in the workplace falls under the title of corporate espionage, which is essentially where an employee from one company who is paid very well works for another company at the very same time in order to steal secrets and bring them to the competing company. So it's a question that depends not just on honesty, or this matter of this moral issue doesn't just depend on honesty. Of course, it crosses over, as we've said, with other virtues such as loyalty and who we're loyal to. We have to think about questions like, if I'm ever in a circumstance where I'm asked to cheat for my own benefit, of course, while I'm working for an organization, and what rules we have within our own organization that necessitate, as we said, something like honesty. Some of us are going to be willing to sort of commit acts of corporate espionage, and others are going to say no. And we'd say, well, it's usually the ethical practitioners that are going to voice their concerns about the types of things that happen when we are dishonest. And of course, this is dishonesty on a very large scale. But if we had to trace it back, we would say it ultimately begins with the types of individuals that we hire to work in a particular corporation or within an organization. There's a lot of other examples that we can talk about that have connection with the virtues that we're essentially trying to develop in the course. But this serves as a reminder that there are a lot of, and I've said this repeatedly, that there are a lot of, not a day goes by where there's not an article in the news about somebody committing an unethical act, or someone who has put their ethics aside, their moral compass aside, for their own self-interest, or in exchange for their self-interest or the interest of the people that they work for. So we're going to think about this as we go through the course, as it applies to each and every one of us on a personal level, and then later on at the organizational level. To add to our discussion, we might think of the study of ethics and the study of morality, at least as, in the introductory sort of phases of it, that we start to think about modes of character. And so what we find in this image is a way of thinking that's proposed by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Richard Paul. And basically what he tells us in his work is that there's three different types of people. There is, on the far left of the screen, you'll see the uncritical person. There is the self-serving person in the middle of your screen, and then to the far right, there is the fair-minded person. So you can see how the things that are associated with the uncritical person are listed there. That in general, Dr. Paul believes that the uncritical person is unconcerned with the development of their intellect, that they don't have interest in asking questions, for example, in pursuing thought when it comes to the decisions they make. They rush to judgment, perhaps more than often. What is the consequence of the uncritical person, or the consequences that the uncritical person will face? Well, in the workplace, this kind of person is going to most definitely be manipulated, and they become easily indoctrinated by others. So if we don't make an attempt to develop our intellect then, or our rationality as we've spoke of previously, then it's going to limit the amount or the capacity that we have to be ethical practitioners. Rationality and reason are going to precede our ability to become ethical practitioners. That is what makes up the ground floor of what we're talking about. Having that ability to reason, or at least agree at the outset that I'm going to try and challenge myself to think about my decisions a little bit more, because we want to avoid being manipulated and indoctrinated. Ultimately, if we follow that path down further, you'll see that what ends up happening for the uncritical person is that they become victims. And they might very well be good-hearted, but they're just fooling themselves because they're oblivious, and they have to sort of activate that intellect as a first step to becoming an ethical practitioner. In the second column, you'll see the self-servicing person, a person who is strictly, or a person that is centered on developing their intellect, but only to the extent that they can help themselves, or selfish interests that they might have, and that we all have. What happens under this particular step process is that self-servicing person can manipulate others, and that's a benefit to them that they can do that, and they're learning to develop their intellect for that, although from an ethical point of view it falls short of why we really need to help others and understand virtue as something that is common to all of us. So what does this result in, or what are the consequences? Other people are going to get hurt by the self-servicing people within a workplace, just as they do within everyday life. Generally, the self-servicing person, it's also fair to say, is unethical and self-righteous, but again, also self-deceived. They're just fooling themselves if they think that they can go through life, basically, without ever challenging or without ever helping others. And that, in effect, to help others is to realize the relationship and the expectations that we have, what we want to take away from good relationships. So then we get to the final side on the far right, and our goal as ethical practitioners, or EPs as I've put there, is to become fair-minded people. The fair-minded person develops their intellect, of course, to serve themselves, but they do that while respecting others. They are also quick to forthrightly act in their, or to say it another way, acting forthright in the relationships I have with others, and being able to have the courage to say when I think something is right and or wrong. This is going to result ultimately, or at least help with, being treated fairly, especially within the workplace, which is something we all desire. So in order to reach that goal that you see at the end, in order to be ethical, in order to be empathetic and just, we need to think about how we can aim towards becoming fair-minded people. It's also important to understand at the outset of a course on ethics that there are two parts to ethics. Previously I mentioned the thinking and doing, and we might think of theory and practice in a similar way, that we have to cover the theoretical doctrines, or the theory or the ideas behind good decisions, behind the virtues that we've talked about, some of the models that we have that we can point to that might help us justify the choices that we make, and the philosophers who've put forth those ideas. And I've said there's going to be psychologists and sociologists that also contribute to the theory side of the study of ethics. At the same time, there is the practice that we can talk about. And in terms of practice, we're always thinking, how can I codify the behavior, my behavior, and of course, in the organization, the behavior of employees to meet up with certain expectations. So we say there's a practical side to the study of ethics and a theoretical side. When we are looking at practice, we're looking at the application of terms, principles. We're looking at case studies, which we're going to do one particular case study through this course. We're going to look at what constitutes a workplace code of ethics and how to put a code of ethics together that is going to that can be worked and applied in the workplace. And then, of course, the standards of conduct. So if we look at theory and practice in the image that you see, we can say that it starts with the individual and that it ends in the corporation. Although there's a big connection that we're making, that it starts the process on a theoretical level and on a practical level. I can be thinking about the virtues that I'm looking to develop, but then after I'm done thinking about them, I want to be able to convert them into everyday practice, whether it be in my personal life or on the job. So through the use of the following example, we're going to attempt to answer the question, who are the ethicists in our workplaces? And then, of course, consider whether or not we are at present fitting of that particular character type, that is the ethical practitioner. We're going to try to think about what we would do in this particular circumstance that I've put on the slide. A co-worker who is also a friend has been moonlighting to make extra money. He was very strict about doing all of the work outside of the office after hours and using his own equipment. But in the past few weeks, you've noticed that he's doing some of the moonlighting work at his desk on company time and with company tools. You confront him, but he argues that summer is slow, he's getting his real work done, and nobody needs to be the wiser. In other words, nobody needs to critique him for his particular choice to do his moonlighting work while he's at work with another job, or while he's expected probably or likely to conform to the duties that he's expected to do on that job rather than his moonlighting job. So the question is very simply, what do you do in that particular circumstance? We might say what your choice is going to be dependent upon how willing you are to tell somebody perhaps above that coworker that he's not using his company time wisely, or that he's not making use of the company time as he should even. And what is it going to take us to react in that type of way, or to further debate with the coworker that it's probably not a good idea, or at least it's not fair for that person to be working on another job while they're getting paid for the same job that you might be doing, or a similar job to what you might be doing within an organization. So how we respond to a question like this gives us an indicator or a reference point to start with in terms of what it's going to take to develop as an ethical practitioner. Because an ethical practitioner is likely going to have some particular suggestions for this type of scenario when it happens. And some of the rationale that an ethical practitioner might use to justify that this is unacceptable behavior, or has something to do with values. So we would say, what value? Well, as an example, fairness. Is it fair for another employee to be doing work from another employer while they're getting paid by the other employer? So we can think about this question as, again, a starting point to sort of frame our understanding of what it's going to take, what's necessary to become an ethical practitioner. So in the last part of this lecture, we look at a brief history of business ethics, where it began, and then of course where we are today and how we've got here. And I start on that slide by saying, before 1960, the ethical questions that related to business and a variety of other areas like healthcare and the environment were often discussed from a theological perspective, theological basis. And we know this because different religions put forth their own moral concepts in accordance with their respective traditions and frameworks. And we started to see the way different religions thought about different virtues and what would be considered ethical and unethical. As we approach the 1960s, and we start to see that it's really pollution that starts the process, or the wheel rolling with the study of business ethics. Western society began to take issue with business practices from organizations and their impact, or pollution and its impact on society and public health. And out of that, the Consumer Bill of Rights was put forth to guarantee that people had a right to safety, they had a right to be informed, and they had the right to choose and a right to be heard. So based on this, the decade of the 1960s, we see that there is an aim. We start to see that there's an aim towards educating people on business ethics. During the 1970s, business ethics slowly emerges as an area of study in academia, i.e. before the 1970s, it would be very difficult to find a course on business ethics as part of a degree program that you would be having to take, as we have today. And in addition, we start to see in academia that people are writing about what a corporate social responsibility really means, and how It's an amplification of self-reflection, as we've talked about, and the beginnings or the underpinnings of morality as it relates to business. During the 1980s, most of us are aware, under the leadership of both President Reagan and President Bush, there were initiatives to allow competition to drive the economy instead of government. And when we allow competition to drive the economy, we have to assume that laws and policies and basically rules are going to be followed a lot less than they would be if the government had a little bit more control of the competition. And so we start to see that competition becomes a problem for a variety of reasons, because when we drive the economy strictly in accordance with competition, then there's going to be a lot of have and have not type situations. One of them in particular I can think of that's regarded or has been called the trickle-down theory, that came out of the Reagan years, where it was thought that if tax breaks were given to the rich or to the corporations, that ultimately the money that was saved by the rich and the corporations would find its way back into the economy. So start at the top with the cuts to taxes as an example. And then what we learned from that era was that people that are rich and companies that have a lot of wealth didn't get wealthy by giving up a lot of their money. So as it turns out, did it work? And that's questionable, whether or not the Reaganomics and that particular model worked in the 80s. For our purpose, the necessity for an economy to function as a result of competition is good, but there has to be some control over what's ethical and what's unethical. And that's a lot of what this relates to a lot of the topics that we discuss later on in the course. During the 1990s, the North American Free Trade Agreement emerges, and there's a big push to trade with other countries or open up the economy to the world to become the global economy that we are today, and open up again with that competition. And governments begin to subsidize corporations. So in other words, governments then play a more active role in business strategy and within the free market. And of course, as ethical practitioners, we're going to learn that there are problems with the free market. If the free means completely free, then there's going to be activity that we have to assume is going to occur within that marketplace, and that's going to be unethical or considered to be morally wrong. Some examples from recent history as it applies to the study of business ethics. Most of us are familiar with Bernie Madoff, the former chairman of the NASDAQ Stock Exchange, who started his own investment advisory firm. He pled guilty to defrauding investors in the amount of over $50 billion by running the largest Ponzi scheme in recorded history, or at least the last 2 decades. In early December 2008, during the economic meltdown in the United States, Madoff could no longer honor his investors' cash requests, and he finally had to come clean and admit that what he had been doing all along was ultimately unethical. And when he admitted to this Ponzi scheme, Wall Street and the world was knocked back on its heels. It was a massive investment fraud that affected many people, including high-profile investors. So we can say with a pretty good degree of accuracy that Mr. Madoff was a self-servicing person, and we have that piece of history to look back upon as an example of dishonesty on a very, very grand scale. But it doesn't stop there. As we've said, there's plenty of examples to look at in history as it relates to dishonesty and some of the virtues that we're talking about. There is ethical scandals, the most recent of which I can say happened just over the Christmas holidays of 2020, 2021, wherein a member of the Ontario, the minister, one of the ministers in Ontario, traveled abroad, and we're starting to think now about some of our political leaders as having put out rules for people to follow that they themselves are not willing to follow. So something to think about as we go forward through the course. How many ethical scandals happen sort of on a weekly basis, and how can we learn from these examples in the way of becoming ethical practitioners? Another recent example of an ethical scandal had to or dealt with Volkswagen in September of 2015. And it was quite interesting to sort of witness this scandal unfold. I was actually teaching this course during that particular time period, and I remember a variety of different events that occurred as a result of Volkswagen's decision to put its vehicles out on the road that tremendously exceeded in some cases, the environmental standards for public health. And I think if you were to Google the Volkswagen scandal now, we can safely say that it's another one of those scandals that we can learn from, even to the extent that, the way the company responds to their unethical practices. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with this particular case, we know now that Volkswagen created an algorithm for some of their vehicles, and the algorithm that was put in these vehicles was intentionally set to bypass environmental emissions tests, so that the cars could be driven around in a variety of different circumstances, for anywhere from 5 to 20% over the acceptable legal limit of emissions. And so in those cases, we understand why Volkswagen would create the algorithm, and we understand it to be unethical as practice. We also understand that our public health, that we're all stakeholders in our public health collectively, and that if we breathe air that is not good for our health, then we should have some recourse in terms of citizens of a community, especially on a sort of a global level. How many countries, exist where these vehicles are driving around and affecting, a whole lot of people in a negative way. And so we're left with questions such as, what should a CEO or a leader of a company such as Volkswagen do in the event that their unethical practice is discovered, right? Well, that's a little bit too late in the game. It is similar to putting the wagon before the horse. We should have thought prior to, or Volkswagen in particular should have thought prior to the scandal, is it ethically justifiable to be able to put this algorithm in those vehicles, and can we support it on ethical grounds? And of course, we would likely agree that the answer to that question is no. So then why did, in these circumstances, how can we explain those events? And so I would ask you to take a look at, to Google the Volkswagen scandal and discover some of the ethical implications that arose as a result of that particular scandal. On this last slide, I ask you to think about the following question: where do my beliefs, values, and ethics come from? And I think this is a thought experiment that helps guide where we're going to go with the course content. These are the things that we're going to talk about as sort of a frame or a beginning point for the study of ethics. It's necessary for us to think about where what I believe and how I came to that belief, what values I have, and what the lines are for those particular values, as we've mentioned before, where my ethics or my moral compass comes from. In conjunction with, thinking about that, the answer to that question, we might say that it's helpful to categorize the source of why, the sources for our decisions. And you'll see I've put an acronym there, PMIT or R. And the PMIT, there's meanings behind each of those letters. P stands for perception, M stands for memory, I stands for introspection, and T stands for testimony. And I'll come back to what the R represents in my explanation. So we make some of our choices on what to believe or what to value based on our perception, based on the sense that we have of the things around us and tying everything together. We also make decisions based on our memory and the memories we have of life experience that helps shape our beliefs and our values. We also can find source or find as a source for our beliefs this idea of introspection or the I in that acronym. By turning inward and thinking about questions a little bit more deeply than others might do, I'm going to get some answers to that question, and it could be more than one answer, but I need to look inwards to get it. And the T again stands for testimony. So we know also when we study ethics that people believe things in accordance with what they've been told. So testimony is the telling of something to another person from which that person takes that testimony and counts it as part of the groundwork for a particular belief or a value. So we do listen to others, especially when we think about authority figures in our societies. We listen to the testimony of doctors if we expect to get better. So there's a lot of occasions where this is perfectly acceptable, and including the study of morality. I can gather some of my values and look at some of my beliefs and what people have told me and make a decision on what I believe, essentially by looking at those testimonials. And so the last letter that you see there is R, and that is rationality or reason, as we've been saying. Some of the beliefs that I'm going to hold and the values that I'm going to have or I'm going to cultivate relate to my ability to understand moral reasoning, understand how rationality is going to help be my guide for a lot of the important decisions that I'm going to make in my life. And of course, within the organization that I might find myself working for one day. So when we're talking about ethics and the study of ethics, it's pertinent to say that there's definitely a link, or that one is a prerequisite for the other. And if we had to say what that link is, we would say its rationality is inextricably linked with our ability to be moral. We need to be able to exercise reason and understand what reasoning really is all about before we can expect to make sound ethical judgments.